In the dust-swept plains of western Oklahoma, 1932, Martha Coleman stood on the cracked earth of her father's farm as the bank representative hammered the foreclosure sign into the dry soil. The last 5 years of drought had transformed once fertile fields into a barren wasteland of broken dreams and unpayable debts. When old Samuel Coleman died, he left his only daughter nothing but 300 acres of worthless dirt and a mountain of debt. The neighboring farmers pitied her. The townspeople mocked her stubborn refusal to sell what little remained, and the powerful Hayes Energy Corporation dismissed her land as the most useless plot in Harper County. None of them knew what really lay beneath the parched Oklahoma soil, a secret that would transform a desperate young woman into the most envied and threatened person in the state. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something truly extraordinary for you. Martha wiped the sweat from her brow as she watched Mr. Caldwell from First National Bank climb back into his shiny automobile. The foreclosure notice would become final in 30 days. She had exactly 1 month to somehow find the money to save what had been in her family for 3 generations. Her father had warned her on his deathbed that she should sell quickly, take whatever pittance they offered, and start fresh somewhere else. "This land has nothing left to give, Mattie," he had wheezed through his dust-damaged lungs. "The dust bowl has beaten us. Some battles you just can't win." But Martha couldn't let go. This farm represented everything her grandparents had built after traveling west in a covered wagon in 1889. They had survived prairie fires, tornadoes, and bandit raids to make something from nothing. Her father had expanded their humble beginnings into a once prosperous operation before the drought and depression hit simultaneously, delivering a 1-2 punch from which they couldn't recover. Now at 25, Martha found herself alone. Her mother had died in childbirth when Martha was just 11. Her older brother Thomas had fled to California 3 years ago, unable to watch their father slowly lose everything. The farmhands had all left, one by one, as Samuel Coleman could no longer afford to pay them. The last farmhand, Elmer Jenkins, had stayed on without wages for months out of loyalty, but finally departed 6 weeks ago to find work in Oklahoma City. Martha retreated into the farmhouse, its weathered boards creaking with each step. Inside, the furniture was covered with a fine layer of dust that seemed to seep through every crack and crevice, no matter how vigilantly she cleaned. The radio on the kitchen table, her father's one luxury purchase in better days, crackled with static as a news announcer discussed President Hoover's latest failed attempt to revive the economy. She silently moved to turn it off, unable to bear more bad news. The silence that followed felt both heavy and strangely comforting. In that moment of quiet, Martha made her decision. She would not become another sad story of the Dust Bowl, another farmer driven from their land. She would find a way. The next morning, Martha rose before dawn and climbed into the family's aging Ford truck. The engine protested, but finally turned over after several attempts. She had exactly $12.43 to her name. Her father's remaining money after the funeral expenses. It wouldn't save the farm, but it might buy her enough gasoline and supplies to implement the desperate plan that had come to her during a restless night. Martha drove into Harpersville, the small town 15 miles from her farm. At this early hour, only the general store showed signs of life as Mr. Peterson prepared to open for the day. He looked up in surprise as Martha rapped on the glass door. "Martha Coleman, what brings you into town so early?" he asked, turning the key in the lock to let her in. His friendly smile barely concealed the pity in his eyes. Everyone in town knew about Samuel Coleman's death and the impending loss of the family farm. "I need some supplies, Mr. Peterson," Martha replied, her voice steady despite her anxiety. "I'm planning to dig a new well on the south section." Peterson's eyebrows shot up. "A well? Martha, honey, your daddy tried drilling 3 wells in the last decade. Each one came up dry as a bone. That's why he had to haul water from the creek those last few years. My father drilled in the north and west sections," Martha countered. "I've been studying his old maps and journals. There's a depression in the south field that might indicate groundwater closer to the surface. It's worth trying." The store owner's expression made clear what he thought of her chances, but he nodded politely. "Well, determination runs in your family, that's for certain. What supplies do you need?" Martha handed him a carefully prepared list: shovels, picks, rope, buckets, and several gallons of kerosene for lamps. The total came to just over $10, leaving her with precious little reserve. As Peterson gathered the supplies, the bell above the door jingled, announcing another early customer. Martha tensed when she saw Richard Hayes, Jr. enter the store. The son of Richard Hayes, Sr., owner of Hayes Energy Corporation. He managed the company's operations in western Oklahoma. Tall and impeccably dressed even at this hour, his tailored suit and polished shoes stood in stark contrast to Martha's worn overalls and scuffed boots. "Miss Coleman," he acknowledged with a nod that carried a hint of condescension. "I heard about your father's passing. My condolences." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," Martha replied stiffly. The Hayes family had been trying to buy the Coleman farm for years, offering insultingly low prices even before the drought had devastated the region. Hayes glanced at the supplies Peterson was gathering. "Planning some work on the farm? That's admirable, though perhaps—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Perhaps not the most practical use of your remaining resources." Martha straightened her spine. "What I do with my land is my business, Mr. Hayes." "Of course," he said smoothly. "I only mention it because my father has authorized me to increase our offer for your property. Given the circumstances, we feel it's the compassionate thing to do." "Compassionate?" Martha couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Your last offer wouldn't cover half of what my father owed the bank." "True, but that was before the foreclosure notice. The economic realities have changed, Miss Coleman. The land simply isn't worth what it once was." His voice lowered as he added, "We're prepared to offer enough to cover your father's debts to the bank, plus an additional $200 to help you relocate and start fresh. It's more than fair in today's market." Martha felt her face flush with anger. The Hayes Energy Corporation had been buying up distressed farms throughout the county for years. They claimed it was for cattle ranching, but they never seemed to run many cattle on the acquired properties. Instead, they simply held the land, occasionally bringing in strange equipment for what they called soil surveys. "My farm isn't for sale, Mr. Hayes," Martha said firmly. "Not today, not tomorrow, not ever." Hayes sighed, a practiced gesture of regretful patience. "I understand this is emotional for you, your family history and all that, but sentiment won't pay the bank, Miss Coleman. Our offer expires when that foreclosure becomes final. After that, we'll likely acquire it directly from the bank for considerably less." He tipped his hat. "Think about it, for your own sake." After Hayes left, Peterson finished boxing up Martha's supplies, his expression troubled. "Don't mean to overstep, Martha, but Richard might have a point. $200 plus clearing your debt. That's more than anyone else in the county has gotten for their land." Martha loaded the supplies into her truck. "My grandfather didn't cross half the country to build something just so I could sell it for pennies on the dollar, Mr. Peterson. There's got to be another way." The storekeeper nodded sympathetically. "You're your father's daughter, that's for certain, stubborn as they come." He hesitated before adding, "Just between us, there's something odd about the Hayes family's interest in all this land. They've bought up nearly 20 farms in the last 3 years, but I've yet to see more than a handful of cattle on any of them." This confirmed Martha's own suspicions. "What do you think they're really after?" Peterson shrugged. "Can't say for sure, but last month I saw some fancy automobiles with government plates visiting their main office. Something's happening, that's all I know." Martha drove back to her farm, her mind racing with questions. The supplies rattled in the back of the truck as she navigated the uneven dirt road. By the time she reached her property, the sun was high in the sky, baking the cracked earth. The farmhouse stood like a lonely sentinel in a sea of dust and withered vegetation. For the next 5 days, Martha worked from sunrise to sunset, digging in the depression she had identified in the south field. The ground was hard and unyielding, baked by years of relentless sun. By the end of the first day, her hands were blistered despite her work gloves. By the end of the second, her back ached so badly she could barely stand upright. Still, she persisted, moving earth one shovelful at a time. On the morning of the 6th day, Martha was nearly 15 feet down in her makeshift well when her shovel struck something different. The sound wasn't the dull thud of packed earth or the clink of hitting stone. It was something else, a hollow metallic echo that reverberated up from below. Confused, she scraped away more dirt, revealing what appeared to be an old metal drum, long buried and forgotten. It was partially crushed, its rusty surface covered in dirt and corrosion. As Martha cleared more earth from around it, she noticed a dark, viscous substance seeping from a crack in the metal. At first, she thought it might be water, the groundwater. She had been desperately seeking, but the liquid was too thick, too dark. With trembling fingers she collected some on her hand and brought it to her nose. The distinctive smell hit her immediately. Oil. Martha sat back on her heels, her heart pounding. Oil. Could it really be oil beneath her worthless farm? She had heard stories of lucky strikes in Texas and other parts of Oklahoma, of overnight millionaires and gushing wells that transformed lives in an instant. But here, on the Coleman farm, which every expert had written off as agriculturally depleted and mineralogically barren, she carefully climbed out of the well and ran to the barn where her father had kept his old geology books. Samuel Coleman had been fascinated by the science of what lay beneath the soil, always believing there might be more to their land than met the eye. Martha had dismissed it as wishful thinking, his way of coping with the increasingly desperate situation. Now she frantically flipped through the pages, searching for information about oil deposits in western Oklahoma. The books confirmed what she was beginning to suspect. The geological formations in this part of the state could indeed harbor significant petroleum reserves, though most large oil companies had focused their exploration efforts elsewhere. What if the Hayes Energy Corporation knew? What if that explained their persistent interest in acquiring not just the Coleman farm, but all the surrounding properties? The soil surveys, the government officials visiting their offices, It all suddenly made terrible sense. Martha slammed the book shut, her mind racing. If she went public with her discovery, Hayes would find a way to take the land before she could profit from it. The foreclosure deadline loomed just 24 days away. She needed help, someone with knowledge of the oil industry, someone she could trust, someone who wouldn't steal this opportunity from her. She thought of Professor Edwin Wilson at the Agricultural College in Stillwater. Her father had consulted him years ago about crop rotation techniques. The professor had specialized in soil science, but also taught geology courses. If anyone could confirm her discovery without alerting Hayes' energy, it would be him. Martha carefully concealed the well opening with boards and brush, making it appear abandoned. She couldn't risk anyone seeing what she had found, not when so much hung in the balance. Tomorrow she would make the long drive to Stillwater with her sample of oil, but tonight she needed to consider every possibility, every angle. As darkness fell, Martha sat at her kitchen table, the kerosene lamp casting long shadows across the room. For the first time since her father's death, a feeling other than grief and desperation filled her heart. Hope. Hope tinged with fear, certainly, but hope nonetheless. The farm that everyone had dismissed as worthless might hold the key not just to saving her family's legacy, but to transforming it into something her father could never have imagined. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the gaps in the weathered boards of the farmhouse. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. If her suspicions about Hayes' energy were correct, her discovery put her in danger. Companies like theirs didn't amass power and wealth by playing fair, especially not with vulnerable, single women trying to save family farms. She extinguished the lamp and moved to the window, peering out at the moonlit landscape of her property. Somewhere out there, beneath the dust and disappointment, lay a potential fortune. And somewhere, perhaps closer than she knew, were people who would do anything to take it from her. The drive to Stillwater stretched longer than Martha had anticipated. Her truck, already temperamental on good days, struggled with the 100-mile journey. Twice she had to stop to let the radiator cool, precious hours ticking away as she sat by the roadside watching dust devils dance across the barren fields that lined the highway. By late afternoon, she finally reached the Agricultural College campus, a cluster of red brick buildings that seemed impossibly grand after the humble structures of Harpersville. The oil sample was carefully wrapped in her father's handkerchief and tucked into her overall pocket, a small, dark treasure that might change everything. Martha made her way to the Earth Sciences building, her worn boots echoing on the polished floors. Students in neat attire gave her curious glances as she passed, her dust-covered overalls and sunburned face marking her clearly as someone who worked the land rather than studied it. She ignored their stares, focused only on finding Professor Wilson. His office door was open, revealing a cluttered space filled with rock samples, maps, and teetering stacks of academic journals. The professor himself sat hunched over a microscope, his gray hair wild and uncombed. At 65, Edwin Wilson had the energy of a man half his age and twice his size. "Professor Wilson?" Martha said hesitantly from the doorway. He looked up, squinting slightly before recognition dawned on his face. "Martha Coleman! Good heavens! What brings you all the way to Stillwater?" He rose to greet her, extending a hand calloused from years of fieldwork despite his academic position. "I need your help, Professor, and your discretion." Martha glanced down the hallway before stepping into his office and closing the door behind her. Wilson raised an eyebrow but gestured to a chair. "Sit down before you fall down. You look exhausted." Martha sank gratefully into the offered seat. "I've been digging a well on our south field. I found something I didn't expect." She carefully removed the handkerchief from her pocket and unwrapped it, revealing the dark, viscous substance. The professor's eyes widened. He took the sample without a word, transferring a small amount to a glass slide which he placed under his microscope. For several moments he examined it in silence, occasionally adjusting the focus. Finally he looked up, his expression unreadable. "Where exactly did you find this?" he asked quietly. "About 15 feet down, in the depression at the south end of our property. There's an old metal drum down there, partially crushed. This was seeping out of it." Wilson shook his head. "That's no drum, Martha. That's likely an old drilling pipe. Someone was looking for oil on your property before." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Professor Wilson before responding. "The quality of this sample suggests the possibility of a substantial field. Harper County hasn't seen much development because the initial surveys weren't promising, but—" He hesitated. "But what?" Martha prompted. "New seismic techniques have changed our understanding of the region's geology. Some areas previously dismissed might actually contain significant reserves trapped in formations we couldn't detect with older methods." He leaned forward. "Miss Coleman, I'd need to conduct proper tests to be certain, but your land could be sitting on a very valuable deposit." Hope surged through Martha, but she remained cautious. "I have a foreclosure deadline in just over 3 weeks. The Hayes Energy Corporation has been trying to buy our farm for years, and I think this is why." Reynolds' expression darkened at the mention of Hayes. "That wouldn't surprise me. Richard Hayes has built an empire by acquiring promising land before anyone realizes its value. He has informants in the Geological Survey Office, patent clerks in his pocket, even some government officials who tip him off about new discoveries." "Can you help me?" Martha asked directly. "I don't have money to pay for exploration, but I'm willing to offer a partnership if the oil is there." Reynolds considered for a long moment. "I have a small drilling rig and crew currently finishing a job near Guthrie. We could be on your property within 3 days." He named terms for a potential partnership: 60% for Martha as the landowner, 40% for his company to cover exploration and development costs. Professor Wilson nodded slightly, indicating the offer was fair. Martha felt a momentary hesitation. This was happening so quickly, and she was putting her family's legacy in the hands of a man she had just met. But the alternative was losing everything to Hayes or the bank. "I accept," she said, extending her hand. Reynolds shook it firmly, his calloused palm matching her own work-hardened hand. "There's one more thing," he added, his expression serious. "If Hayes suspects what we're doing, he'll try to stop us. I've crossed paths with him before. He doesn't like competition, and he plays rough." "What can we do?" Martha asked. "Keep this quiet. Tell anyone who asks that you're still digging for water. I'll bring my equipment in at night and we'll set up in that south depression where it's not visible from the main road." Reynolds traced a finger on the napkin where Martha had roughly sketched her property. "We'll need to work fast. If there's oil, we need to hit it and document it legally before your foreclosure deadline." That night, Martha stayed in Stillwater, accepting Professor Wilson's offer of his spare room. She couldn't afford a hotel, and the long drive back would leave her too exhausted to prepare for Reynolds' arrival. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind whirled with equal parts hope and fear. If there truly was a significant oil deposit beneath the Coleman farm, it wouldn't just save her from foreclosure, it would transform her life completely. But standing against Hayes Energy Corporation carried risks she was only beginning to understand. Martha rose before dawn the next morning, eager to return home and prepare for Reynolds' arrival. Professor Wilson provided her with coffee and a solid breakfast before walking her to her truck. "Be careful, Martha," he warned as she prepared to depart. "Knowledge is power, but in this case, it's also dangerous. Don't tell anyone what you're planning, not friends, not neighbors, no one." "I won't," she promised. "Thank you, Professor, for everything." The drive back to Harper County passed more quickly than the journey to Stillwater had. Martha's mind was too full of plans to notice the hours slipping by or the increasingly ominous clouds gathering on the western horizon. By mid-afternoon, she could see the dust storm brewing, a towering wall of dirt advancing across the plains like a biblical plague. She pushed the truck harder, racing to reach home before the storm hit. The last major dust storm had reduced visibility to zero for nearly 2 days, making travel impossible and breathing difficult even indoors. If she could just make it to the farm, she could secure the house and barn before the worst arrived. Martha was less than 5 miles from home when she spotted the black automobile parked at the side of the road ahead. A man in a suit stood beside it, waving his arms to flag her down. With great reluctance, she slowed the truck, recognizing Richard Hayes, Jr., as she drew closer. "Miss Coleman!" he called over the rising wind as she stopped. "Thank goodness! My automobile has suffered a mechanical failure, and this storm is nearly upon us." Martha's breath caught. "Oil? Then I was right. This is crude oil without question." He held the slide up to the light. "High quality too from initial appearance. Low sulfur content based on the odor." He returned to his desk, his movements suddenly more deliberate. "Martha, do you understand what this could mean? It could save our farm," she said simply. Wilson laughed, though there was little humor in the sound. "Save it? Child, if there's a significant deposit under your land, it could make you one of the wealthiest women in Oklahoma." His expression sobered. "But it also makes you a target. Who knows about this?" "No one. Not yet." Martha explained her suspicions about Hayes Energy Corporation and their persistent efforts to buy her family's land. The professor listened intently, occasionally nodding. "The Hayes family has a reputation," he said when she finished. "Richard Hayes Sr. started with one small refinery 20 years ago. Now they control half the oil production in 3 states. They didn't achieve that by being scrupulous." "Do you think they know there's oil on our land?" Martha asked. "Almost certainly," Wilson confirmed. "The geological indicators would be visible to experienced surveyors. The question is, why haven't they drilled themselves? Why buy up the land first?" Martha's mind raced. The government officials Mr. Peterson saw visiting their offices. Could that be related? Wilson stroked his chin thoughtfully. "Possibly. There have been rumors about new federal regulations coming for the oil industry. President Hoover's administration has been discussing stricter oversight of petroleum reserves." He moved to a large map on his wall, tracing his finger over the western Oklahoma region. "If Hayes has identified a major oil field spanning multiple properties, they might be trying to secure ownership of the entire area before filing for drilling permits. That would give them complete control over production, pricing, everything." Martha felt a chill And my farm sits in the middle of their planned field, which explains their persistence, Wilson agreed. But this also gives you leverage, if you can prove the oil exists and secure the rights before the foreclosure. How do I do that? I don't have the money for professional drilling equipment or geological surveys. The professor paced his office, thinking. You need capital and expertise. Normally, I'd suggest approaching one of the independent oil companies to partner with you, but there's not enough time before your foreclosure deadline. He stopped suddenly. There might be another way. He rifled through a stack of papers on his desk, finally extracting a telegram. One of my former students, Jack Reynolds, is in the area. He was working for Gulf Oil but left to start his own small exploration company. He's been looking for promising sites the bigger companies have overlooked. Can we trust him? Martha asked. Wilson's expression was serious. Jack has integrity, which is rare in the oil business. His father was a farmer who lost everything to dishonest speculators during the last boom. He won't cheat you. He glanced at his watch. He's staying at the Stillwater Hotel. If we hurry, we might catch him before he leaves for his next site. 20 minutes later, they sat in the hotel restaurant across from Jack Reynolds, a lean, sun-weathered man in his early 30s. Despite his relative youth, his eyes carried the sharp assessment of someone who had seen both success and failure in his chosen field. He studied the oil sample Martha had brought, occasionally glancing up at her with increasing interest. This came from your farm in Harper County, he asked, his voice carrying the slight drawl of western Oklahoma. Martha nodded. About 15 feet down. Professor Wilson thinks it might be from an old drilling pipe. Abandoned test well, most likely, Reynolds agreed. Probably from the early explorations after the First World War. A lot of those early operations were poorly documented, especially if they didn't hit productive depths right away. But you think there could be a significant deposit, Martha pressed. Martha glanced at the vehicle, noting no obvious signs of damage. Suspicion flickered through her mind, but basic humanity wouldn't allow her to leave anyone stranded in the face of an advancing dust storm. Get in, she said tersely. I'll drop. You in town after the storm passes? Hayes climbed into the passenger seat, brushing dust from his expensive suit. Most generous of you, especially given our previous conversation. I admit I was concerned you might drive past out of spite. I'm not in the habit of leaving people to suffocate in dust storms, Mr. Hayes, Martha replied coldly, accelerating. Again, even people I don't particularly like, he laughed, seemingly unaffected by her hostility. Direct as always. I admire that quality, actually. Too many people in business waste time with unnecessary pleasantries. Martha didn't respond, focusing instead on the rapidly deteriorating visibility as the first tendrils of the dust cloud reached them. By the time they turned onto the dirt road leading to her farm, the air was already thick with particles, the sun reduced to a dim orange glow through the haze. Where were you coming from? Hayes asked conversationally as they pulled up to the farmhouse. Unusual to see you so far from home with things as they are. Martha tensed slightly. Supply run, she answered vaguely, not meeting his eyes. Had to go farther than usual to find what I needed. Hayes studied her profile but didn't press further. As they hurried into the house, the wind howled with increasing ferocity, driving stinging particles against their skin. Martha moved quickly to stuff rags into the window frames and place wet towels along the bottom of the door. Familiar routine in dust storm country. You seem well practiced at this, Hayes observed, removing his suit jacket and carefully folding it over a kitchen chair. "Fifth major storm this year," Martha replied. "They're getting worse." The house creaked and groaned as the full force of the storm hit, darkness descending despite the early hour. Martha lit kerosene lamps, their glow creating a small island of light in the gloom. Outside, the world had disappeared behind a wall of swirling dust. "Looks like you'll be stuck here until it passes," she said, trying to mask her discomfort at having haze in her home. "Could be hours, might be tomorrow." "Unfortunate timing," he agreed smoothly, "though perhaps an opportunity for us to speak more candidly about your situation." Martha busied herself preparing a simple meal from her limited supplies, hoping to avoid further conversation. But Hayes was persistent, watching her movements with calculated interest. "I couldn't help but notice the excavation in your south field," he remarked. "Quite deep for a well attempt." Martha's hand stilled momentarily before she continued slicing bread. "As I told you before, Mr. Hayes, what I do on my land is my business." "Of course," he conceded, "though as someone with considerable experience in land management I might offer some advice. That particular location seems unlikely to yield water." "I'll take my chances," Martha replied, placing a plate of bread and preserved meat before him. It was far from the fine dining he was accustomed to, but it was all she had to offer. Hayes accepted the simple fare with a nod of thanks. "You know," he said after taking a bite, "my father started with nothing. A common misconception is that the Hayes fortune was inherited. In truth, he built everything from scratch, much like your grandfather did." "Is there a point to this history lesson?" Martha asked bluntly. Hayes smiled thinly. "Simply that he recognized opportunity where others saw only obstacles. It's a quality I believe you possess as well, Miss Coleman. The difference is that my father also knew when to change course rather than pursue a losing battle." "The only losing battle," Martha replied evenly, "is giving up something valuable for less than it's worth." Hayes' eyes narrowed slightly at Martha's words, a flicker of calculation passing across his face before his expression returned to one of casual interest. "And what exactly do you believe your land is worth, Miss Coleman? The bank's assessment puts it at significantly less than what we've offered." Martha took a measured sip of her water, buying time to choose her words carefully. "Land value isn't just about what can be grown on the surface, Mr. Hayes. My grandfather always said to consider what lies beneath and what stands beside, not just what grows above." "Folksy wisdom," Hayes commented with a dismissive smile. "But I'm afraid the financial institutions aren't particularly moved by sentimentality. 23 days remain until foreclosure, correct? The clock is ticking rather loudly, I would imagine." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, driving dust against the windows with a sound like sand being thrown against glass. The kerosene lamps flickered, shadows dancing across the worn furniture and the faces of the two adversaries seated at the kitchen table. "I'm well aware of my deadline," Martha replied evenly, "and I have plans in motion." "Plans?" Hayes raised an eyebrow. "I hope they're more practical than digging holes in barren ground. Though I am curious, what exactly do you think you might find in that particular section of your property?" The direct question confirmed Martha's suspicions. He knew something about the south field, perhaps even about the abandoned drilling pipe she had discovered. She maintained her composure, refusing to reveal anything in her expression. "Water, Mr. Hayes. The one thing every farmer in this region desperately needs." "Indeed." He didn't look convinced. "And your trip today, was that related to these plans of yours?" Before Martha could respond, a heavy thump against the side of the house made them both turn. The wind was throwing debris against the structure now, a common but unnerving aspect of the worst dust storms. The increasing violence of the storm seemed to parallel the tension in the room. "The storm's getting worse," Martha observed, rising from the table. "I need to check that the livestock shelter is secure." "You'll excuse me." Hayes stood as well. "Allow me to assist. My automobile may have failed me, but I'm not entirely useless in practical matters." Martha wanted to refuse, to keep him away from anything that might reveal her true activities, but she couldn't think of a reasonable objection. "Very well. You'll need this." She handed him an old bandana to cover his nose and mouth against the dust. Together they ventured into the howling maelstrom, hunched against the stinging particles that found their way into eyes, ears, and clothing, despite their precautions. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, barely visible through the brown haze. Martha led the way, one hand clutching her hat to her head, the other gripping a lantern that provided minimal light in the artificial dusk. The interior of the barn offered some relief from the worst of the storm, though dust still filtered through every crack and crevice. Martha's remaining livestock, 2 milk cows, a few chickens, and an elderly plough horse, huddled miserably in their stalls. She moved quickly to check their water troughs while Hayes stood just inside the doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "You maintain this place admirably," he observed, glancing around at the organized tools and well-kept structure. "Most failing farms I visit have deteriorated much further by this stage." "The Coleman farm isn't failing," Martha corrected him sharply. "It's facing temporary challenges." Hayes laughed softly. "A diplomatic way of describing bankruptcy and foreclosure." His gaze drifted to the far corner of the barn, where Martha had stored the well-digging equipment. "Those are substantial tools for a water-seeking operation. One might almost think you were searching for something more significant." Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Hayes was fishing for information, trying to confirm what he already suspected. She needed to deflect his curiosity, without arousing further suspicion. "My father believed in being properly equipped for any task," she replied, checking the horse's feed bin. "Though I'm sure it all seems quaint compared to the industrial equipment your company employs." Hayes moved farther into the barn, approaching the stored tools with casual interest. "Actually, I admire the ingenuity required to operate a farm with limited resources. It demonstrates a certain resourcefulness." He picked up one of the smaller shovels, examining its worn blade. "Though I wonder if this resourcefulness might be better applied to securing your future elsewhere, rather than desperately clinging to land that has already demonstrated its limitations." Martha took the shovel from his hands and returned it to its place. "The land's limitations aren't always what they appear to be, Mr. Hayes. Sometimes, with persistence, surprising things emerge." His eyes met hers, and in that moment, Martha was certain he knew exactly what she had discovered. The pretense between them stretched thin as old muslin, ready to tear at the slightest pressure. "Surprising things," he echoed softly. "Yes, I suppose that's true." He glanced toward the barn door where the dust continued to swirl. "When this storm passes, I would be interested in seeing this well you're digging. Perhaps my company's resources might be of assistance after all." Martha kept her expression neutral, though alarm bells rang in her mind. "That's not necessary. As I said, I have plans in place." Plans that involve Professor Edwin Wilson from the Agricultural College, perhaps? Or is it Jack Reynolds you're working with? The mention of both names in such quick succession stunned Martha into momentary silence. How could Hayes possibly know about her meetings in Stillwater? She had only just returned. Hayes smiled at her visible surprise. You see, Miss Coleman, Hayes Energy Corporation maintains a wide network of associates. When the daughter of a recently deceased farmer makes an unexpected journey to speak with a geology professor and an independent oil prospector on the same day, it attracts a certain attention. Martha's shock gave way to anger. You've been having me followed. Monitored might be a more accurate term, Hayes corrected smoothly. We take a natural interest in properties adjacent to our holdings, especially when unusual activities commence. You have no right. I have every right to protect my company's interests, Hayes interrupted, his affable demeanor slipping to reveal something harder beneath. Just as you have every right to seek the best outcome for yourself. The question is whether those rights need to be in conflict. A gust of wind rattled the barn doors violently, as if nature itself was responding to the tension between them. One of the cows lowed nervously, shifting in its stall. What exactly are you suggesting? Martha asked warily. Hayes straightened his dusty vest, resuming his businesslike composure. A collaboration, Miss Coleman. You have something we want, and we have the resources you desperately need. Rather than opposing forces, we could be partners. Partners, Martha repeated skeptically. Somehow, I doubt Hayes Energy Corporation offers true partnerships to small landowners. In special circumstances, we make exceptions. He extracted a small notebook from his pocket and wrote something on a page before tearing it out and offering it to Martha. This is our revised offer for your property. As you can see, it's substantially more generous than our previous proposals. Martha glanced at the figure, nearly 10 times what Hayes had offered just days ago. The amount would not only clear her father's debts, but leave her with a comfortable sum to start fresh elsewhere. For a fleeting moment, she considered accepting, imagining the relief of escaping the crushing pressure of imminent foreclosure, but the sudden increase told her everything she needed to know. If Hayes was willing to pay this much, the oil beneath, her land must be worth far more. And his knowledge of her meetings in Stillwater suggested he had spies or informants she hadn't yet identified. This is a one-time offer, Hayes added when she didn't immediately respond. Available only until I leave your property after the storm passes. After that, we return to our original strategy. Which is what, exactly? Martha challenged, handing the paper back without accepting it. Waiting for the bank to foreclose so you can acquire my land for even less. Among other options, Hayes replied, his tone carrying a subtle warning. Jack Reynolds is a persistent man, but his company operates on very thin margins. Equipment failures happen, permits get delayed, financial backers withdraw unexpectedly. The implied threat hung in the air between them, as tangible as the dust that swirled through the barn's interior. Martha felt her heart racing but kept her expression carefully controlled. Hayes was revealing too much, showing his desperation. To acquire her land quickly, that gave her leverage if she was brave enough to use it. I'll consider your offer, she said finally, turning toward the barn door. Right now, we should return to the house before this storm worsens further. Hayes followed her outside, where the dust had thickened to the point that the farmhouse was barely visible, despite being only 50 yards away. They struggled through the choking cloud, faces covered, eyes squinting against the stinging particles. By the time they reached the relative safety of the kitchen, both were coated in a layer of fine brown dust that worked its way into every fold of clothing. "Oklahoma hospitality at its finest," Hayes commented dryly as he removed his now ruined bandana and attempted to brush the worst of the dust from his suit. "Though I can't help wondering if you're secretly pleased about the timing of this storm. It keeps me here, unable to report back to my father or interfere with whatever preparations you might be making." Martha poured water from her precious reserves into a basin, offering him a clean cloth to wash his face. "I have no control over the weather, Mr. Hayes, though if I did, I assure you I'd use that power for something far more useful than delaying your business communications. Like ending the drought that's bankrupting half the farmers in the state," Hayes suggested, accepting the cloth with a nod of thanks. "That would be a start." Martha moved to the stove, stoking the small fire to prepare coffee. The temperature was dropping with the storm, a common occurrence that could make the farmhouse uncomfortably cold by nightfall. Hayes watched her efficient movements, his expression thoughtful. "You know, in some ways, we're not so different, Miss Coleman. Both of us see potential where others see only desolation. Both willing to take risks when the stakes are sufficiently high." Martha measured coffee grounds carefully, making the most of her dwindling supply. "The difference, Mr. Hayes, is that I'm fighting to save something built through generations of honest work. You're simply looking to expand an empire already larger than any company should reasonably be. Progress requires consolidation of resources," Hayes countered. "The small, independent operations can't compete in today's economy. It's not personal. It's the natural evolution of industry." "It feels rather personal from where I'm standing," Martha replied, placing a steaming cup before him. The coffee was weak. She had stretched the grounds as far as possible, but it was hot and would help ward off the chill seeping into the house. As night fell, the storm showed no signs of abating. The howling wind and continuous impact of dust against the windows created an eerie backdrop to their tense coexistence. Martha found herself in the bizarre situation of preparing a simple evening meal for the very man who represented the greatest threat to her future. Hayes attempted several times to return to the subject of her discovery in the South Field, but Martha deflected each inquiry with practiced vagueness. She could tell his patience was wearing thin, his corporate courtesy gradually giving way to frustrated directness. "Let's speak plainly, Miss Coleman," he said finally, as they sat in the dimly lit kitchen after their meager supper. "We both know what you found in that hole you've been digging. The question is whether you understand the full implications of your discovery." Martha met his gaze steadily. "I understand that what's beneath my land has value. Value that you and your father have been trying to acquire for pennies on the dollar for years. Value that requires significant capital to extract," Hayes countered. "Capital you don't have and can't possibly secure before your foreclosure deadline. Even if Reynolds manages to bring in equipment, which I assure you will face unexpected complications, the legal process of establishing mineral rights takes time. Time you've run out of." Martha's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "You seem remarkably well informed about my activities for someone who supposedly just discovered I was digging for something other than water." Hayes smiled thinly. "Let's just say Hayes Energy maintains thorough intelligence on potential acquisitions. We've been monitoring your property for some time, including my father's correspondence, his financial records." Martha's suspicion, long simmering, suddenly crystallized. Did you arrange for the bank to call in his loans early? The slight flicker in Hayes's eyes was all the confirmation she needed. Her suspicion turned to cold certainty. The financial pressure that had driven her father to despair hadn't been merely bad luck or the general economic collapse. It had been engineered. Banking decisions are complex, Hayes replied carefully. Relationships between financial institutions and larger corporate entities often involve mutual accommodations. You deliberately drove him to bankruptcy, Martha said, her voice low, with controlled fury. You pushed him to the breaking point, hoping he'd sell before he died, and when he didn't, you assumed I'd be easy to manipulate afterward. Business, Hayes said simply, dropping even the pretense of denial. Sentiment is a luxury, Miss Coleman. Your father understood that at the end. He knew the land would be better off in hands that could develop it properly. Is that what he told you when you pressured him to sell while he was grieving over his terminal diagnosis? Martha demanded, rising from her chair, unable to contain her anger any longer. He was a practical man beneath the stubborn exterior, Hayes replied, remaining seated. In our final conversation, he acknowledged the inevitability of progress. His concern was primarily for your welfare after he was gone. Martha felt as though she'd been struck. You spoke to him. When? 2 days before he passed. I visited him while you were in town arranging his medications. Hayes' expression carried something almost like genuine sympathy. He was very weak, but lucid. He expressed regret at leaving you with such a burden, spoke of wishing you would start fresh somewhere else after he was gone. The revelation staggered Martha. Her father's final days had been filled with cryptic comments about accepting reality and seeing things clearly at last. She had attributed these to his medication and declining condition, but now they took on a more sinister meaning. What did you say to him? She asked, her voice barely audible over the storm outside. Hayes met her gaze directly. I offered him peace of mind, assurance that Hayes' energy would provide for your future if he agreed to a post-mortem sale arrangement. And did he agree? Martha asked, though she already knew the answer. Her father would never have consented to selling the land, not even at the end. Unfortunately, he was unable to complete the necessary paperwork before his condition deteriorated, Hayes admitted. But his verbal agreement was clear. I had hoped you would honor his final wishes once you understood the reality of your situation. Martha's grief and anger crystallized into something harder, more focused. Hayes had manipulated her father in his weakest moments, trying to extract a deathbed agreement that would have no legal standing, but might influence her decisions afterward. The calculated cruelty of it, preying on a dying man's concern for his daughter, revealed the true nature of the man sitting across from her. Get out, she said quietly, her voice carrying more authority than if she had shouted. Hayes didn't move. The storm. I don't care about the storm. Get out of my house. Sleep in the barn if you must, but I won't spend another minute under the same roof with you. Be reasonable, Miss Coleman, Hayes began, but Martha cut him off. The only reason you're not walking into that dust storm right now is that I won't have the death of even someone like you on my conscience. But come morning, storm or no storm, you're leaving this property, and you can tell your father that the Coleman farm will never belong to Hayes Energy, to Hayes. Not while I'm alive to prevent it. The night passed, with agonizing slowness. Martha sat awake in her father's old rocking chair, a loaded shotgun across her lap. She didn't truly believe Hayes would attempt anything violent while under her roof, but the knowledge that he had manipulated her father in his final days had shattered any remaining trust. The storm continued unabated, raging against the farmhouse like a living entity, filling every crack and crevice with fine dust, despite her best efforts to seal the windows and doors. Hayes had retreated to the front parlor without further argument, accepting a worn blanket with curt thanks. The physical distance did little to ease the tension that filled the house. Martha could almost feel his calculating presence through the wall, like a predator temporarily held at bay but still watching, waiting for an opportunity. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the dust-caked windows, Martha moved to the kitchen to stoke the stove. The storm had diminished somewhat, though visibility remained poor beyond the immediate yard. She prepared a pot of coffee, the familiar routine helping to steady her nerves after the sleepless night. "I see hospitality extends even to unwelcome guests," Hayes observed from the doorway, his once immaculate suit now rumpled and stained with dust. Despite his disheveled appearance, he maintained his air of corporate confidence as if conducting negotiations from behind a polished desk, rather than standing in a farmhouse kitchen during a dust storm. Martha poured a cup without responding and set it on the table, maintaining as much distance between them as the small kitchen would allow. "The storm appears to be lifting," Hayes continued, gesturing toward the window. "I should be able to arrange transportation back to town within a few hours." "Good." Martha's reply was clipped, her gaze fixed on the coffee pot rather than meeting his eyes. Hayes sipped his coffee slowly. "I regret that our conversation took such an unpleasant turn last night. Business and emotion often make difficult companions." "Is that what you call it? Business?" Martha finally looked at him directly, her exhaustion giving way to renewed anger. "Pressuring a dying man? Manipulating bank loans to force foreclosure? Following me to Stillwater and threatening my associates? The oil industry isn't for the faint of heart, Miss Coleman." Hayes set his cup down carefully. "What lies beneath your land could change the economic future of this entire region. The stakes justify certain aggressive strategies. Nothing justifies what you did to my father." Hayes sighed, a practiced gesture of regretful patience. "Your father was a proud man who couldn't accept that the world had changed around him. The family farm as he knew it was already dead. Not because of Hayes' energy, but because of economic realities he refused to acknowledge. I simply tried to secure the best possible outcome for everyone involved." "Everyone except the Colemans," Martha countered. "Your land will be developed whether you cooperate or not," Hayes said, his voice hardening. "The only variable is whether you benefit financially from that development or lose everything to foreclosure. My offer remains available until I leave this property. After that, Hayes Energy will pursue alternative approaches." Martha poured herself a cup of coffee, needing the warmth to combat the chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "You still don't understand. This isn't just about money for me. This land represents 3 generations of my family's blood, sweat, and sacrifice. I won't surrender it, especially not to someone who sees it as nothing but a resource to exploit." "Admirable sentiment," Hayes replied with thinly veiled condescension. "But sentiment doesn't pay banknotes. The economic reality is—" "The economic reality," Martha interrupted, "is about to change. I know what's beneath my land now, and I have partners willing to help me develop it." Hayes's expression darkened. Reynolds is a minor player with limited resources. One word from Hayes Energy to his suppliers, and he'll find himself unable to secure the equipment needed for a proper drilling operation. Perhaps, Martha acknowledged, but Reynolds isn't the only one interested in challenging Hayes Energy's monopoly. Your father has made enemies over the years, Mr. Hayes. Powerful ones who would be delighted to support a competing venture. The subtle shift in Hayes' posture told Martha her bluff had hit home. While she had no concrete commitments beyond Reynolds' partnership, Hayes couldn't know that for certain. The oil industry was competitive and cutthroat. The possibility that his family's rivals might be circling would concern him. "Name them," Hayes challenged, his composure slipping slightly. Martha smiled coolly. "I don't think I will. As you said, business is business." Before Hayes could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention. Martha moved to the window, wiping away dust to peer outside. 3 trucks had pulled into the yard, their arrival mostly obscured by the lingering haze of the storm. Men began unloading equipment from the beds, drilling gear, pipes, and tools. "It seems my partners have arrived ahead of schedule," Martha said, unable to keep the triumph from her voice. Reynolds had promised 3 days, but he must have accelerated his plans upon learning of Hayes's presence at the farm. Hayes joined her at the window, his face hardening as he recognized Jack Reynolds climbing down from the lead truck. "This changes nothing," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "Small operations like Reynolds fail constantly in this business. Accidents happen. Financing disappears. Permits get denied. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hayes?" "Simply stating facts, Miss Coleman. The oil business is hazardous in many ways." Martha met his gaze steadily. "So is interfering with legitimate operations. If anything happens to delay this project, I have arrangements in place to ensure that certain documents reach the State Attorney General's office. Documents detailing Hayes Energy's methods of acquiring properties, including your manipulation of bank loans and pressure tactics on vulnerable landowners." It was another bluff. She had no such documents, but the flash of uncertainty in Hayes's eyes suggested it had found its mark. Companies like his operated in gray areas of the law, counting on the desperation and powerlessness of their victims to avoid consequences. "Fabricated claims would constitute slander," Hayes said carefully. "Hayes Energy has substantial legal resources." "I'm counting on a thorough investigation," Martha replied. "One that examines banking records, property transfers, and the curious pattern of accidents that seem to befall your competitors. How much scrutiny could your father's business practices withstand, Mr. Hayes?" A knock at the door interrupted their standoff. Martha opened it to find Jack Reynolds on the porch, his expression brightening when he saw her, but darkening immediately upon noticing Hayes behind her. "Martha," he greeted her with deliberate informality, a clear message to Hayes that they shared more than a business relationship. "We pushed through the night when Professor Wilson telegraphed about your visitor." He nodded coldly toward Hayes. "Everything all right here?" "Just fine," Martha assured him, stepping aside to let him enter. "Mr. Hayes was caught in the storm yesterday and required shelter. He was just preparing to leave." Hayes studied Reynolds with undisguised contempt. "Reynolds, still chasing scraps from the big operators' tables, I see. Finding opportunities they've overlooked, more like," Reynolds corrected, meeting the corporate man's gaze without flinching. "Though in this case, I suspect you didn't overlook anything. Just miscalculated how far Miss Coleman would go to protect her family's legacy." "A temporary setback," Hayes replied smoothly, reaching for his dust-covered hat. Miss Coleman has declined our generous offer, which is certainly her prerogative. But this matter is far from resolved. I believe it is, Reynolds countered. We filed the mineral rights claim at the county office yesterday afternoon. Expedited processing due to the impending foreclosure situation. The paperwork should be officially recorded by noon today. Martha looked at Reynolds in surprise. He hadn't mentioned this step during their meeting in Stillwater. He caught her eye with a slight smile. Professor Wilson suggested we might face administrative obstacles if we waited. His brother-in-law works in the county clerk's office. Very helpful gentleman. Hayes' face betrayed momentary shock before his corporate mask reasserted itself. Filing a claim doesn't guarantee its approval. There are procedures, reviews, all properly followed, Reynolds interrupted. We've learned to be thorough when operating in territories where Hayes' energy shows interest. Too many mysterious delays otherwise. Martha watched Hayes, mentally recalculating his options, like a chess player whose carefully planned strategy had suddenly been upended. The mineral rights filing significantly changed the equation. Even if foreclosure proceeded, those rights would remain with her, rather than transferring automatically with the land. This isn't over, Hayes said finally, directing his words to Martha rather than Reynolds. You've made a serious miscalculation aligning yourself against Hayes' energy. My father doesn't tolerate interference with his acquisitions. Tell your father, Martha replied evenly, that Samuel Coleman's daughter doesn't tolerate corporate vultures preying on her family's land. Now, I believe you mentioned arranging transportation back to town. Hayes straightened his dust-covered jacket with as much dignity as he could muster. That won't be necessary. I see one of my company vehicles approaching now. He gestured toward the road where, indeed, a black automobile with the Hayes Energy logo was making its way through the dissipating dust clouds. Convenient timing. Reynolds remarked dryly. Hayes Energy is nothing if not efficient, Hayes replied. He turned to Martha one last time. Consider carefully the path you've chosen, Miss Coleman. There are consequences to opposing progress. After Hayes departed in the company car that had so conveniently appeared, Martha stood with Reynolds in her front yard, watching the drilling equipment being unloaded. The dust storm had finally passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape, where every surface was coated in a fine layer of brown silt. The air still carried the gritty taste of earth, but the oppressive curtain of the previous day had lifted. You filed the mineral rights yesterday? Martha asked, still processing this unexpected development. How did you manage that so quickly? Reynolds smiled, looking more relaxed now that Hayes had departed. Professor Wilson moved heaven and earth. After you left Stillwater, called in every favor he was owed. When he telegraphed that Hayes was stranded here, we knew we needed to accelerate our timeline dramatically. Thank you, Martha said simply, for everything. Don't thank me yet, Reynolds cautioned, his expression growing more serious. Hayes wasn't making empty threats. His father has destroyed smaller operations than mine for lesser provocations. We need to establish a producing well as quickly as possible to secure additional financing and protection. Martha glanced toward the south field, where Reynolds' men were already setting up the drilling equipment. How long will it take? If we're lucky and the deposit is where we think it is, 3 to 5 days to reach it. The abandoned drilling pipe you found suggests it's not too deep. He hesitated before adding, but we need to be prepared for Hayes to throw obstacles in our path, anything from equipment failures to legal challenges. Can we hold out for the 22 days until my foreclosure deadline? We'll do more than hold out, Reynolds promised, his jaw set with determination. "By this time next week, I intend to have oil flowing on the Coleman farm. Once that happens, no bank in Oklahoma would dare foreclose. They'll be lining up to extend your loans instead." As the day progressed, Martha worked alongside Reynolds' crew, carrying tools, bringing water, and helping wherever needed. The physical labor was a welcome distraction from the emotional exhaustion of the previous night's confrontation with Hayes. By mid-afternoon, the drilling rig stood assembled in the depression where she had made her discovery, its mechanical profile incongruous against the rural landscape. "We'll begin drilling at first light tomorrow," Reynolds explained as they stood examining the completed setup. "The engine noise carries too far at night. No sense advertising our progress to Hayes's spies any more than necessary." Martha nodded, surveying the transformation of her south field. Just days ago, she had been digging alone with hand tools, desperate for water or any salvation from foreclosure. Now, a professional drilling operation was underway, with the potential to change not just her future, but the economic landscape of the entire region. "Hayes will know soon enough anyway," she pointed out. "That automobile that collected him wasn't a coincidence. They've been watching the farm." "Undoubtedly," Reynolds agreed. "But every hour we gain is valuable. His father will need time to mobilize serious opposition, especially if they weren't expecting us to move this quickly." As evening approached, Reynolds' crew established a small camp near the drilling site. 2 men would remain on guard overnight, a precaution that Martha might have considered excessive before her confrontation with Hayes. Now it seemed prudent, bordering on necessary. Martha invited Reynolds to join her for supper at the farmhouse, a simple meal prepared from her dwindling supplies. As they ate, he outlined the days ahead, the drilling process, what to expect if they hit oil, the immediate steps needed to establish a producing well. "Once we have oil flowing, everything changes," he explained, spreading a rough map of her property across the kitchen table. "We'll need to build storage tanks here," he indicated a flat area near the drilling site, "and arrange transportation to the nearest refinery. Initially, we'll likely have to sell to one of the major companies, possibly even Hayes if they offer the best terms." "Sell to Hayes?" Martha asked incredulously. "After everything they've done?" Reynolds smiled grimly. "In the oil business, yesterday's enemy is today's business partner. Once we're producing, Hayes will have 2 choices: try to crush us completely, which carries significant legal and practical risks, or adapt to our existence and find a way to profit from it. And which do you think he'll choose?" "The senior Hayes is ruthless but pragmatic. He'll likely try intimidation first, followed by predatory pricing or supply chain interference. But if we can weather that storm, he'll eventually offer a business arrangement." Reynolds took a sip of his coffee. "The son is another matter. Richard Jr. has something to prove. He takes opposition personally." Martha thought of Hayes's cold eyes as he had departed that morning, the barely concealed fury beneath his corporate veneer. "He threatened us quite explicitly. I'm not surprised." Reynolds' expression grew serious. "Martha, I need to be clear about something. What we're doing, challenging Hayes Energy on their home turf, carries real risks, not just financial ones. There have been incidents in other oil fields, fires, equipment failures, occasionally violence. You think they'd go that far? I think Richard Hayes Sr. didn't build an oil empire by accepting defeat gracefully, and his son seems determined to prove himself just as ruthless." Reynolds hesitated. "It's not too late to reconsider." We could still negotiate a partnership with them, on better terms than they initially offered. Martha shook her head firmly. After what they did to my father, no. Whatever risks come with standing against them, I'll face them. Reynolds studied her for a moment, then nodded. Then we proceed as planned, but we take every precaution. No one works alone. The drill site is guarded round the clock. And you— He fixed her with a concerned look. You don't leave the farmhouse without someone accompanying you. I've been managing this farm alone since my father died, Martha protested. And Hayes wasn't actively targeting you then, Reynolds countered. This isn't about your capability, Martha. It's about recognizing the nature of our opponent. The drilling began at dawn, the rhythmic thump of machinery breaking the prairie silence that had enveloped the Coleman farm for generations. Martha stood watching as Reynolds directed his crew, the technical terminology flowing between them incomprehensible to her farmer's ears. Yet she understood enough. Each foot they descended brought them closer to either salvation or disappointment. We're making good progress, Reynolds reported during their midday break, wiping sweat and oil from his hands with a rag. The soil composition is favorable, not too much limestone or shale to slow us down. How deep will you need to go? Martha asked, passing him a canteen of water. Hard to say exactly. Based on the abandoned pipe you found and the regional geology, I'd estimate between 500 and 800 feet. With this equipment and these conditions, that's 3 to 4 days of drilling, assuming no complications. Martha glanced at the horizon, where dust clouds signaled approaching vehicles. Speaking of complications, Reynolds followed her gaze, his expression hardening as he recognized the Hayes Energy logo on the lead automobile. 3 vehicles in total, carrying what appeared to be company officials and workmen. Stay behind me, Reynolds said quietly as the cars pulled up to the farmhouse. Let me handle this. Richard Hayes, Sr., emerged from the first automobile, his substantial frame and commanding presence making him instantly recognizable, even though Martha had never met him personally. In his mid-60s, the elder Hayes had built his oil empire from nothing, expanding aggressively through boom and bust cycles that had destroyed less determined operators. Beside him stood his son, whose expression combined embarrassment and simmering anger. Clearly, his report on yesterday's confrontation had not been well received. 2 men in suits emerged from the second car, carrying briefcases and looking every inch the corporate lawyers they undoubtedly were. The third vehicle disgorged several rough-looking men whose purpose seemed less official, muscle rather than management. "Mr. Reynolds," the elder Hayes called out as he approached, ignoring Martha entirely. "I understood you were smarter than this." Reynolds stood his ground, arms crossed. "Smart enough to recognize a valuable opportunity when I see one, Mr. Hayes, and foolish enough to think you can develop it without interference." Hayes Sr. surveyed the drilling operation with critical eyes. Inadequate equipment, minimal crew, no proper storage facilities, amateur hour all around. "We've only just begun," Reynolds replied evenly. "Additional resources are en route." The elder Hayes laughed, the sound devoid of humor. "No, they're not. Your equipment suppliers in Oklahoma City received a rather significant order from Hayes. Energy this morning. They'll be far too busy fulfilling our needs to service yours." He turned his attention to Martha for the first time. "Miss Coleman, I presume. Your father was a stubborn man. I see the trait runs in the family." Martha stepped forward despite Reynolds' cautioning glance. My father was a man of principle who wouldn't be bullied or manipulated. Another family trait. Principles are luxuries, young woman. They don't pay banknotes or develop oil fields. Hayes Sr. gestured to one of the suited men, who stepped forward with an opened briefcase. I have here an injunction from Judge Hollister preventing any drilling activity on this property pending a review of mineral rights claims. Reynolds took the document, scanning it quickly. This is ridiculous. Our claim was properly filed and registered. There's no legal basis for this injunction. Judge Hollister disagrees, Hayes Sr. replied smoothly. He's concerned about potential environmental impacts on neighboring properties, specifically the risk of contaminating the water table that extends beneath our adjacent holdings. Martha recognized the strategy immediately, a delaying tactic. Even if the injunction was eventually overturned, the legal process would consume precious days, perhaps weeks. With her foreclosure deadline looming, time was the one resource she couldn't spare. This won't hold up, Reynolds said, handing the document to Martha. Judge Hollister is known to be in Hayes Energy's pocket. We can appeal to the district court. By all means, Hayes Sr. agreed with a predatory smile. I believe they're scheduling new cases for mid-October. That would be... He made a show of checking his pocket watch. Approximately 3 months after Miss Coleman's foreclosure becomes final. Such unfortunate timing. We don't need 3 months, Martha countered. We have Reynolds' equipment already in place. We'll have oil flowing within a week. No, you won't, Hayes Sr. said, his cordial tone hardening. Because any attempt to continue drilling in violation of this injunction will result in immediate arrest for contempt of court. Sheriff Parker is on his way now to ensure compliance. He gestured toward the rough-looking men from the third car. My security team will remain on site until he arrives to prevent any misunderstandings. Reynolds stepped closer to Martha, lowering his voice. He's bluffing about some of this, but the injunction itself is real enough. Sheriff Parker is indeed in Hayes's pocket. If we openly defy the court order, we'll end up in jail, and the drilling will be shut down regardless. Martha felt panic rising within her. Everything had been proceeding so promisingly, and now, with a single piece of paper, Hayes had brought their operation to a halt. There must be something we can do, she whispered urgently. We need legal counsel, Reynolds replied. Someone who understands oil law and isn't afraid of Hayes. I know a lawyer in Tulsa who's helped independent operators before, but it will take time to get him here. Time is exactly what we don't have, Martha reminded him, conscious of Hayes Sr. watching their whispered exchange with evident satisfaction. The elder Hayes approached them again, having apparently decided that enough time had passed for the reality of their situation to sink in. Now that you understand your position, perhaps we can discuss a more productive path forward. He motioned to his son. Richard has been authorized to present a final offer for the Coleman property, including full mineral rights. The younger, Hayes stepped forward, his earlier embarrassment now hidden behind a mask of corporate efficiency. Hayes Energy is prepared to offer $15,000 for the property and all associated rights. This sum would clear all existing debts and leave Miss Coleman with a substantial amount to relocate and begin anew elsewhere. The figure was staggering. Far more than Martha had ever imagined her Dust Bowl-ravaged farm could command. It represented financial security, a fresh start without the crushing burden of her father's debts. For a moment, temptation flickered within her. Reynolds must have sensed her wavering. If Hayes is offering 15,000, the oil deposit is worth at least 10 times that amount, he said quietly. Don't let them steal your future. Hayes Sr.'s eyes narrowed at Reynolds' intervention. The offer is contingent on immediate acceptance and signing of all transfer documents today. By tomorrow morning, it reverts to our previous figure. And if I decline both offers, Martha asked, straightening her spine, then we will proceed with acquiring the property through the foreclosure process, Hayes Sr. replied coldly. The injunction ensures you cannot establish a producing well before your deadline expires. Once the bank takes possession, we already have an agreement in place to purchase the land at a significantly reduced price. The mineral rights won't transfer with foreclosure, Reynolds pointed out. Martha's claim has been properly filed. A claim that will be tied up in litigation for years, Hayes Sr. countered, during which time not a drop of oil will flow, nor a penny of revenue be generated. How long can your small operation sustain? Such a fight, Reynolds. How will you pay your crews, maintain your equipment, cover legal fees? He turned to Martha. How will you live, Miss Coleman, with no farm income and no oil revenue? Pride makes a cold companion on winter nights. The brutal pragmatism of his argument hit Martha with physical force. She had no resources to sustain a protracted legal battle. If the injunction prevented them from establishing a producing well, before the foreclosure deadline, her position would become increasingly untenable. I need time to consider, she said finally. You have until sundown, Hayes Sr. replied. My lawyers will remain to answer any questions and complete the paperwork should you come to your senses. Meanwhile, my security team will ensure no further drilling takes place in violation of the injunction. As the Hayes contingent retreated to their automobiles, Martha and Reynolds walked toward the farmhouse, maintaining a careful distance to ensure their conversation remained private. He systematically eliminated every option, Martha said, despair creeping into her voice. Even if your lawyer from Tulsa could get here tomorrow, what could he possibly do against an injunction that's already been granted? Reynolds was silent. For a moment, his expression thoughtful rather than defeated. There might be another approach. The injunction specifically prohibits drilling activities on your property, correct? Martha nodded, retrieving the document from her pocket to double-check the exact wording. It says, any and all drilling operations, mineral extraction activities, or related development work on the Coleman farm property as defined by the current deed and property lines. The current property lines, Reynolds repeated, a glimmer of excitement entering his eyes. Martha, where exactly is your south boundary? It runs along Willow Creek, about a quarter-mile beyond the drilling site. Why? And who owns the adjacent property? The Mendoza family. They have a small farm on the other side of the creek. Manuel Mendoza worked for my father occasionally before the drought forced him to take a railroad job. His wife, Elena, still maintains their place. Martha's eyes widened as she began to understand Reynolds' thinking. You want to move the drilling operation to their property. The geology doesn't stop at property lines, Reynolds confirmed. If the oil deposit extends beneath both properties, which is likely given the regional formation, we could drill from their land and still tap the same reservoir. But wouldn't Hayes just get another injunction against drilling on the Mendoza property? Eventually, yes, but it would take time we could use to get her well established, and more importantly, it would create a legal complication. The Mendoza's would have a legitimate claim to a portion of any oil found, even if it's primarily beneath your land. Hayes couldn't simply wait for foreclosure to solve his problem. Martha considered the idea. Elena Mendoza might agree. They've been struggling even worse than we have since Manuel took the railroad job. But we'd have to move all your equipment across the creek without Hayes's security team noticing. Not all of it, Reynolds said, his mind clearly racing ahead. We could leave the current rig in place as a decoy, make it look like we're complying with the injunction while secretly moving essential components at night. The plan was audacious, perhaps even desperate, but it offered a slim chance where moments before there had seemed none at all. It's worth trying, Martha decided, but we'll need to speak with Elena immediately, before Hayes gets wind of what we're planning. I'll send my most trusted man, Luis Alvarez. He's Mexican-American, speaks Spanish fluently. He might have better luck explaining our proposal to Mrs. Mendoza. Reynolds glanced toward the Hayes automobiles, where the security team was already establishing a watch post near the drilling rig. I'll create a distraction to ensure no one follows him. While Reynolds engaged the Hayes security team in a loud dispute over their exact authority under the injunction, Luis Alvarez slipped away from the drilling site. Martha provided him with detailed directions to the Mendoza farm, along with a personal note to Elena, explaining their situation and proposing a partnership that could benefit both families. The hours of waiting that followed were among the most difficult Martha had endured. Hayes Sr. and his son had departed, leaving behind their lawyers and security team with instructions to maintain the pressure. By mid-afternoon, Sheriff Parker arrived to officially serve the injunction, though his sympathetic glances toward Martha suggested his involvement was reluctant rather than enthusiastic. "I'm just doing my job, Martha," he said quietly, as he posted the court order on the drilling equipment. "Your daddy was a good man. This doesn't sit right with me." "Then help us fight it," she urged. Parker shook his head regretfully. "Hayes practically owns this county. He built the new courthouse, funded the hospital extension, keeps half the businesses in town afloat with his workers' wages. I go against him. I'm not just risking my job, I'm risking everything." His candid admission confirmed what Martha already knew. Hayes's influence extended far beyond his corporate holdings into the very fabric of local governance and law enforcement. Fighting him through official channels would be nearly impossible. As evening approached, Luis Alvarez finally returned, his expression carefully neutral as he rejoined the drilling crew. Only when he managed to position himself near Martha did he murmur. She agreed. Midnight. The back pathway through the cottonwood grove. Relief flooded through Martha. Elena Mendoza had accepted their proposal, offering her land as an alternative drilling site in exchange for a percentage of any oil produced. Now they needed only to execute the nighttime equipment transfer without alerting Hayes's watchful security team. Martha joined them as they began setting up the transported equipment, her hands and face blackened with soot from the barn fire, but her spirit lighter than it had been since Hayes's arrival that morning. "It worked," she said quietly to Reynolds, as they watched his crew assemble the modified drilling rig. "How soon can we begin?" "We'll be ready by dawn," he replied. "The setup is minimal compared to our original operation, but it should be sufficient to reach the deposit. The question is, how quickly Hayes will realize what we've done. His men will discover the missing equipment components at first light," Martha acknowledged. "How long before they connect it to the Mendoza property?" "Not long. Hayes has eyes everywhere, but legally their injunction doesn't apply here. They'll need to seek a new court order, which buys us at least a day, possibly two. Reynolds studied her soot-stained appearance. That was quite a sacrifice. Burning your own barn. Martha looked back toward her property, where the barn still smoldered, its ancient timbers reduced to glowing embers against the night sky. It was just a building. What matters is what we're fighting for. The drilling began again at dawn, the smaller rig making slower progress than the original equipment, but steadily advancing nonetheless. Martha divided her attention between the new operation on the Mendoza property and monitoring the reaction from Hayes' security team. As expected, they discovered the equipment tampering shortly after sunrise, their angry shouts carrying across the fields as they realized they'd been outmaneuvered. Elena Mendoza proved to be not just a willing partner, but an enthusiastic one. A small, wiry woman in her early 40s, with iron-grey streaks in her dark hair, she approached the drilling operation with practical questions and keen interest. Unlike many in the area, she showed no hesitation about a woman taking charge of such an enterprise. My husband's grandfather was a silver miner in Chihuahua, she explained to Martha as they watched Reynolds' crew work. In our family, we know the value of what lies beneath the earth. The Americans think they invented this business, but my people have been pulling treasure from the ground for centuries. Martha found unexpected comfort in Elena's matter-of-fact approach. Hayes will come after you too, once he realizes what we're doing. Are you prepared for that? Elena's expression hardened. Hayes and men like him have been coming after families like mine since before I was born. They think because we have Spanish names and darker skin, we will be easily frightened. She spat on the ground. My father fought with Pancho Villa. I'm not afraid of rich men in automobiles. By mid-morning, the Hayes response arrived in force. 3 vehicles crossed onto the Mendoza property, parking at what they likely considered a safe but intimidating distance from the drilling operation. Richard Hayes Jr. emerged from the lead car, his expression a mixture of fury and grudging respect as he surveyed the relocated equipment. Clever, he acknowledged as he approached Martha and Reynolds, flanked by 2 security men. Technically beyond the reach of our injunction, but only temporarily. Your business on my land? Elena Mendoza stepped forward, positioning herself alongside Martha with her arms crossed firmly over her chest. Hayes barely glanced at her. Mrs. Mendoza, I presume. I assume you've been misled about the legal implications of allowing this operation on your property. Hayes Energy is prepared to compensate you for any inconvenience if you order these people to leave immediately. This is a legitimate business arrangement between myself and Miss Coleman, Elena replied coolly. Your opinion is neither requested nor required. Hayes's jaw tightened at her dismissal. A business arrangement that will collapse when our lawyers file an expanded injunction this afternoon. Judge Hollister will sign it by sundown, by which time we'll have reached the oil, Reynolds countered, though Martha could hear the uncertainty beneath his confident tone. The smaller rig was making progress, but not as quickly as they had hoped. Once we've established a producing well, the legal dynamics change significantly. Do they? Hayes smiled thinly. Tell me, Reynolds, how many producing wells have you successfully defended against Hayes Energy's legal department? The count seems to be 0 thus far. Reynolds devised a strategy. Under cover of darkness, they would move only the essential drilling components, enough to establish a basic operation on the Mendoza property while leaving the main framework in place to maintain the appearance of compliance with the injunction. The plan required perfect timing, absolute silence, and a distraction to occupy the Hayes security men at the critical moment. "I'll handle the distraction," Martha volunteered. "This is my farm, my future at stake." Reynolds looked concerned. "Hayes's men aren't known for their gentle treatment of those who interfere with their assignments. It could be dangerous." "More dangerous than losing everything my family has built?" Martha countered. "Besides, they won't harm a woman. Not with Sheriff Parker likely to hear about it. They'll be rough, perhaps, but not violent." As midnight approached, Martha prepared for her role. The Hayes security team had established a small camp near the drilling rig, with 2 men maintaining watch while the others attempted to sleep. Their automobiles were parked between the farmhouse and the drilling site, positioned to block any attempt to access the equipment. Martha's plan was simple but effective. She would create a disturbance at the farmhouse, far enough from the Willow Creek boundary to draw attention away from the equipment transfer, but significant enough to require all hands to investigate. At precisely 11:45, Martha set fire to her own barn. The structure had been gradually deteriorating for years, emptied of livestock and equipment as the farm's fortunes declined. Now it served one final purpose, creating a massive, unmissable distraction. Martha ensured the fire was positioned to minimize any risk of spreading to the main house or neighboring fields, then ran toward the security camp, screaming for help. The reaction was immediate. All 4 security men leapt to their feet momentarily, disoriented by the sudden commotion and the growing orange glow illuminating the night sky. "Fire! The barn's on fire!" Martha shouted, her performance convincingly frantic. "Help me save the animals!" Instinct overcame suspicion. The men grabbed buckets and ran toward the blazing structure, leaving the drilling equipment temporarily unguarded. In the confusion, Reynolds and his select crew members began quietly dismantling key components, loading them onto wagons with cloth-wrapped wheels to muffle the sound. Martha led the security team on a desperate but ultimately futile firefighting effort, strategically positioning herself between them and the drilling site to block their view. By the time they realized the barn was beyond saving and no animals were actually at risk, nearly 30 minutes had passed. Precious time for Reynolds' operation. "Mighty convenient timing for a barn fire," one of the security men said suspiciously, eyeing Martha through smoke-reddened eyes. "Lightning strike," Martha replied without hesitation. "There was a flash just before it caught. You can see the storm clouds moving in from the west." Indeed, the night sky had clouded over, though no lightning had actually struck. The darkness provided additional cover for Reynolds's team as they continued their covert equipment transfer. "We should get back to the rig," another security man said, glancing toward the drilling site. From their position, the equipment's silhouette looked unchanged in the darkness, exactly as Reynolds had planned. "Thank you for your help," Martha said, injecting genuine gratitude into her voice. "I couldn't have saved the house without you." The simple human acknowledgement seemed to ease their suspicions somewhat. They returned to their posts, tired and smoke-stained, but with their vigilance somewhat diminished by the night's excitement. By 2 in the morning, the critical drilling components had been successfully transported across Willow Creek to the Mendoza property. Reynolds had selected a drilling site just 50 yards beyond the property line, technically outside Hayes's injunction, but positioned to access the same oil reservoir. Before Reynolds could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew everyone's attention. Sheriff Parker and two deputies rode onto the property, their expressions grim as they took in the confrontation. "Sheriff," Hayes greeted him with evident satisfaction. "Perfect timing. We were just explaining to Miss Coleman and Mrs. Mendoza that their operation will be shut down by a new injunction this afternoon. Perhaps you could emphasize the legal consequences of their continued defiance." Parker dismounted slowly, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow despite the relatively cool morning. "Actually, Mr. Hayes, that's not why I'm here." He pulled a telegram from his pocket. "This arrived at my office an hour ago from the federal prosecutor in Oklahoma City. I've been instructed to ensure that no one interferes with the Coleman-Mendoza drilling operation until further notice." Hayes snatched the telegram, his face darkening as he read it. "This is absurd. On what grounds could a federal prosecutor possibly take interest in a local property dispute?" "Something about potential violations of the new federal oil regulations," Parker replied, his tone carefully neutral, though Martha detected a hint of satisfaction. "Apparently, someone sent documentation suggesting Hayes Energy has been manipulating property acquisitions to circumvent the Petroleum Conservation Act." Martha and Reynolds exchanged surprised glances. Neither of them had contacted federal authorities. Who could have taken such initiative on their behalf? The answer arrived moments later as another automobile pulled up beside the sheriff's horses. Professor Edwin Wilson emerged, accompanied by a sharp-featured man in a formal suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Ah, excellent. We're not too late," the professor said cheerfully, seemingly oblivious to the tension permeating the scene. "Sheriff Parker received our telegram, I see. Martha, Mr. Reynolds, allow me to introduce Mr. Howard Simmons from the Department of Justice Oil Division. He's very interested in Hayes Energy's activities in this region." The federal agent stepped forward, extending a hand to Martha. "Miss Coleman, Professor Wilson has shared some concerning documentation regarding your situation. The department is particularly interested in patterns of anti-competitive practices in the petroleum industry." Hayes had regained his composure, though his eyes burned with barely suppressed rage. "This is an inappropriate federal intrusion into a straightforward local business matter. Judge Hollister's connections to Hayes Energy are among the issues under investigation." Simmons interrupted smoothly. "I've reviewed the initial injunction against Miss Coleman's property. The environmental concerns cited appear to have no scientific basis and directly contradict geological surveys conducted by the department last year." Martha felt a surge of hope. Professor Wilson must have reached out to his contacts in government immediately after her visit to Stillwater, building a case while she focused on the immediate drilling challenges. The elderly academic caught her eye with a subtle wink, confirming her supposition. "Hayes Energy has operated ethically and legally in all its acquisitions," Hayes insisted, though his usual corporate confidence had noticeably diminished. "These insinuations are groundless and potentially slanderous." "Then you'll have ample opportunity to present exculpatory evidence," Simmons replied. "My office will be conducting a comprehensive review of Hayes Energy's property acquisitions throughout this region over the past 5 years, with particular attention to banking relationships, judicial rulings, and any patterns of obstruction against independent operators." Hayes turned to Sheriff Parker, appealing to established local power structures. "Parker, you can't seriously be supporting this federal overreach." Washington bureaucrats have no understanding of our regional business practices. The sheriff replaced his hat, his expression carefully neutral. I'm following legal instructions from duly appointed federal authorities, Mr. Hayes, same as I do for you or any citizen. The slight emphasis on citizen carried a clear message. Parker was no longer operating as Hayes's personal enforcer. With his immediate options evaporating, Hayes retreated to his automobile, pausing to deliver a final warning to Martha. This temporary intervention changes nothing in the long term, Miss Coleman. Federal investigations move at a glacial pace. Your foreclosure deadline remains less than 3 weeks away. Unless you have producing oil by then, the bank will still take your property. After Hayes and his entourage departed, the federal agent discussed the situation with Martha, Reynolds, and Professor Wilson. The temporary federal protection would prevent Hayes from securing additional injunctions against their operation. But as Hayes had pointed out, it didn't solve the fundamental deadline problem. We need to reach oil within the next 2 weeks to secure financing that would prevent foreclosure, Martha explained. This smaller rig is making progress, but it's slower than our original equipment. Simmons nodded thoughtfully. My authority extends to preventing interference with your legitimate business activities, not to financial intervention. However, he hesitated, glancing at Professor Wilson, there may be another approach worth considering. The geological survey, Wilson confirmed, extracting a folder from his worn leather satchel. Mr. Simmons' department conducted a comprehensive assessment of this region last year, including core samples and seismic readings. Their data might help pinpoint the optimal drilling location, potentially saving days of exploration. Reynolds examined the survey documents with growing excitement. This is extraordinarily detailed work, far beyond what's typically available to independent operators. According to these readings, the primary deposit is actually 30 yards east of our current location and potentially at a shallower depth than we estimated. How did Hayes obtain this information before it was publicly released? Martha asked, the pieces suddenly connecting in her mind. That's why they've been so interested in acquiring this specific cluster of properties. An excellent question, Simmons replied. One of several my office will be investigating. It appears certain government employees may have been providing confidential survey data to Hayes Energy, allowing them to acquire properties with known petroleum deposits before. The information became public. With the federal survey data in hand, Reynolds immediately redirected the drilling operation to the more promising location. By nightfall, they had descended nearly 300 feet, making significantly better progress than before. The mood at the site was cautiously optimistic, though everyone recognized that Hayes would be exploring alternative methods to disrupt their work. We should establish a round-the-clock security watch, Reynolds suggested as darkness fell. Hayes isn't used to being thwarted. He may resort to less official tactics now that his legal options are temporarily blocked. Martha agreed, organizing a rotation that included herself, Elena Mendoza, and several trusted members of Reynolds's crew. As she took the first watch, sitting on an overturned bucket near the drilling rig with a shotgun across her lap, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in just over a week. From solitary desperation facing foreclosure to the center of an oil development protected by federal authorities, it seemed almost unreal. Elena joined her several hours later, bringing coffee in a chipped enamel pot. You should rest, she advised, pouring the steaming liquid into tin cups. Tomorrow will be another difficult day. I'm too wired to sleep, Martha admitted, gratefully accepting the coffee. Every sound makes me think Hayes's men are coming to sabotage the equipment. Elena settled beside her on another bucket, her dark eyes scanning the moonlit landscape. My father used to say that when powerful men feel threatened, they become like wounded animals, more dangerous because they are desperate. Hayes certainly seemed desperate today, Martha agreed. I've never seen him lose composure like that before. Men like him believe they own not just the land, but the law itself, Elena observed. When they discover otherwise, it shakes the foundation of their world. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. My husband says Hayes has been buying out the smaller Mexican and Indian landowners for years, offering barely enough to relocate. Those who refused often experienced accidents, barn fires, livestock poisonings, broken equipment. The methodical pattern sounded familiar. He did the same to white farmers too, Martha said, including my father. He manipulated bank loans, created financial pressure, even visited my father on his deathbed, trying to extract an agreement. Eleanor nodded grimly. The color of our skin may differ, but our value to men like Hayes is the same. Only what can be taken from us. Their conversation continued through the quiet hours, two women from different backgrounds finding common ground in their determination to protect what belonged to them. By dawn, a bond had formed that transcended their business arrangement, a solidarity based on shared struggle against the same powerful adversary. The drilling continued with renewed urgency, the federal survey data proving invaluable in directing their efforts. By mid-afternoon of the following day, they had reached nearly 500 feet, more than halfway to their estimated target. Reynolds monitored the operation constantly, examining soil samples and making minute adjustments to the drilling angle. The geology is consistent with the survey predictions, he reported during a brief break. We're definitely on the right track. I'm starting to detect traces of petroleum in the deeper samples. Martha allowed herself a cautious optimism. How much longer until we know for certain? 2 days, maybe 3 at our current rate, Reynolds estimated. The formation is becoming more promising with each 100 feet. Professor Wilson had returned to Stillwater to gather additional documentation for the federal investigation, but promised to return before their crucial deadline. Agent Simmons had departed for Oklahoma City, but left instructions with Sheriff Parker to maintain protection of the drilling site against any interference. As evening approached on their second day of federally protected drilling, Martha was inspecting supplies when she noticed a lone rider approaching from the direction of town. As the figure drew closer, she recognized Elmer Jenkins, her father's former farmhand, who had left months earlier to seek work in Oklahoma City. "Miss Martha," he called, dismounting with the easy grace of a lifelong horseman. "Been trying to reach you for days. Rode straight from the city when I heard what was happening." Martha embraced him warmly, genuinely pleased to see the weathered face of her father's most loyal worker. "Elmer, what brings you back to Harper County?" "News about Hayes Energy trying to take your land, and something about oil being discovered." His expression grew serious. "But that's not the main reason I came. I've been working as a janitor at the First National Bank's offices in Oklahoma City, the main branch that controls your local bank." Martha's attention sharpened immediately. "The same bank that called in my father's loans early?" "The very same," Elmer confirmed. "And I've been hearing things, Miss Martha. Things that didn't sit right with me. especially concerning your property. He explained that while cleaning the bank president's office late at night, he had overheard a telephone conversation regarding the Coleman farm. The bank had apparently entered into a specific arrangement with Hayes Energy they would accelerate the foreclosure process on properties Hayes wanted to acquire in exchange for preferential financing terms on Hayes' expanding operations. They specifically mentioned your deadline being moved up by over a month from the original schedule, Elmer said. It wasn't normal financial procedures. It was a deliberate strategy to help Hayes acquire the land before you could discover what was beneath it. Do you have any proof of this arrangement? Martha asked, her mind racing with the implications. Elmer hesitated before reaching into his jacket. Nothing that would stand up in court, but I did something that might cost me my job if anyone finds out. He produced several folded papers. I borrowed these from the bank president's files. Letters between him and Richard Hayes Sr., discussing their arrangement regarding your property and several others. Martha examined the documents, her hands trembling slightly as she recognized the explicit collusion between the bank and Hayes Energy. The letters detailed not just the accelerated foreclosure schedule, but the artificially reduced property valuation designed to make independent refinancing impossible. Elmer, these could be crucial to stopping the foreclosure, she said, looking up at her father's faithful employee with newfound hope. Would you be willing to show these to the federal agent who's investigating Hayes? That's why I brought them, Miss Martha. Your daddy always said the Colemans stand for what's right, even when it costs them. Seems only fitting I should do the same. Martha immediately sent word to Agent Simmons in Oklahoma City, explaining the new evidence and requesting his urgent return. Meanwhile, the drilling operation continued round the clock, each hour bringing them closer to the potential breakthrough that could transform the Coleman farm from a foreclosure statistic to a valuable oil-producing property. The following morning brought an unexpected visit from Richard Hayes Jr., arriving alone in a modest automobile rather than with his usual entourage. His approach was observed with immediate suspicion by Martha and Reynolds, who intercepted him before he could reach the drilling site. "I come in peace," Hayes said, raising his hands slightly to emphasize the point. "No lawyers, no security. Team, no sheriff, just a business proposition that might benefit all parties." "We're not interested in selling," Martha replied firmly, "and federal authorities have made it clear that any interference with our operation will have serious consequences." "I'm not here to interfere or to purchase," Hayes clarified, his tone lacking its usual corporate arrogance. "I'm here to propose a partnership." Hayes' proposition hung in the air as Martha and Reynolds exchanged skeptical glances. The man who had tried to destroy them now wanted to be their partner. It seemed too convenient, too sudden. "A partnership," Martha repeated, her voice flat with disbelief. "After everything your family has done to sabotage us." Hayes gestured toward the drilling operation. "Business is business, Miss Coleman. My father may be willing to wage extended legal battles, but I recognize a losing strategy when I see one. Your evidence of banking collusion, combined with the federal investigation, has changed the equation significantly." "Why should we trust you?" Reynolds demanded. "You shouldn't," Hayes admitted with surprising candor. "But consider the practical reality. Even if you reach oil within days, establishing a productive operation requires infrastructure, transportation arrangements, refining contracts, all areas where Hayes Energy holds significant advantages." Martha studied him carefully. "And what Exactly would this partnership entail? Hayes Energy provides immediate financing to prevent foreclosure, plus all necessary infrastructure for full-scale production. In exchange, we receive a 40% interest in the operation, with you retaining controlling interest at 60%. The offer was unexpectedly reasonable, suspiciously so. What does your father think of this generous proposal? Hayes' expression tightened momentarily. He doesn't know about it. This would be a separate venture under my direct management, not part of the primary Hayes Energy portfolio. Understanding dawned on Martha. You're competing with your father. Let's say I'm pursuing a more progressive approach to resource development. Hayes replied carefully. One that recognizes the changing legal landscape and the benefits of cooperation over confrontation. 3 days later, as Martha stood beside the drilling rig on the Mendoza property, the entire trajectory of her life changed with a deafening roar. Oil erupted from the ground in a spectacular black fountain, showering everyone within 50 feet. In petroleum, the crew erupted in cheers as Reynolds confirmed what they all could see. They had struck a major deposit, potentially one of the most significant in western Oklahoma. The partnership with the younger Hayes proved surprisingly effective. True to his word, he provided immediate financing that not only prevented foreclosure but enabled rapid expansion of the operation. Within weeks, additional wells were established on both the Coleman and Mendoza properties, with pipelines connecting to transportation networks. Richard Hayes Sr. attempted to sabotage the new venture through various legal and financial maneuvers, but the federal investigation had weakened his influence significantly. When the Department of Justice formally charged several bank officials with fraud and collusion related to the forced foreclosures, many of Hayes Sr.'s political allies distanced themselves from his operations. Martha insisted that the partnership agreement include favorable terms for the Mendoza family and other neighboring farmers. The Coleman Hayes Mendoza Oil Company became known throughout the region not just for its productivity, but for its equitable treatment of landowners and workers, a revolutionary approach in an industry dominated by exploitation. 6 months after discovering oil on her worthless land, Martha established the Coleman Foundation, dedicated to supporting sustainable agricultural practices and education for farm families struggling through the Dust Bowl. The once dilapidated farmhouse was renovated to serve as headquarters for both the foundation and the oil company, a symbol of transformation and perseverance. Elena Mendoza used her share of the oil profits to establish a medical clinic serving the Hispanic and indigenous communities largely ignored by existing healthcare systems. The two women, from such different backgrounds, became powerful advocates for rural development and economic justice throughout Oklahoma. Richard Hayes Jr. eventually broke completely with his father's company, focusing instead on expanding the more progressive business model he had pioneered with Martha. The partnership transformed from a marriage of convenience into a genuinely innovative enterprise that challenged industry standards. When a journalist from the Oklahoma City Times interviewed Martha on the first anniversary of the initial oil strike, he asked what had sustained her through the darkest days of nearly losing everything. Faith, she answered simply. Not just in God, though that was important. Faith in the land itself. My grandfather always said that the earth provides for those who respect it. Everyone else looked at our farm and saw only the dust and disappointment on the surface. I remembered to look deeper. As for Elmer Jenkins, the farmhand whose brave decision to share banking documents had helped secure Martha's victory. He declined her offer of a management position in the company. Instead, he used his settlement from the bank fraud case to purchase his own small farm, becoming one of the first beneficiaries of the Coleman Foundation's agricultural support program. Professor Wilson continued teaching at the Agricultural College, using the Coleman-Mendoza case as a teaching example of how scientific knowledge, legal persistence, and personal courage could combine to challenge even the most entrenched powers. His petroleum geology course became unexpectedly popular among students from farming backgrounds inspired by Martha's success. The Great Depression and Dust Bowl continued to ravage much of the American heartland throughout the 1930s, driving thousands of farm families westward in search of survival. Yet in one small corner of western Oklahoma, a community flourished. Around the oil fields that a determined young woman had refused to surrender. Martha never remarried, dedicating herself instead to managing her business interests and foundation work. When asked if she regretted remaining single, she would smile and gesture toward the productive oil derricks dotting the once barren landscape. "Some people are meant to create families," she would say. "I was meant to create something else." The worthless land that neighbors had pitied and powerful men had coveted became one of the most valuable properties in the state, not just for the oil beneath it, but for the principle it represented. The story of Martha Coleman's stand against Hayes Energy became regional legend, inspiring other independent operators and landowners to resist corporate intimidation tactics. By 1940, the Coleman-Hayes-Mendoza Oil Company had expanded into 3 states, its distinctive business practices creating a model that challenged the extractive approach typical of the industry. Martha's insistence on environmental considerations and fair treatment of landowners, once dismissed as naive idealism, gradually gained recognition as forward-thinking business strategy. On her father's birthday each year, Martha would visit his grave in the small cemetery behind the rebuilt barn. "You were right about the land, Daddy," she would tell him. "It did have more to give. You just couldn't have imagined how much." The incredible story of Martha Coleman reminds us that sometimes what appears worthless to others might contain your greatest treasure. In life's most desperate moments, looking deeper, beneath the surface problems, beyond obvious solutions, can reveal unexpected possibilities. Have you ever discovered value in something others dismissed as worthless? Share your stories in the comments below. And if Martha's perseverance inspired you today, make sure you're subscribed to our channel for more extraordinary true stories of courage and determination against overwhelming odds. Next week, we'll bring you the remarkable account of a Dust Bowl teacher who transformed an abandoned railway car into a school that produced 3 future governors. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss it. Until then, remember Martha's wisdom. Sometimes, what's most valuable lies beneath the surface, waiting for someone with enough faith to discover it.